Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'd like to discuss the fifth Shadow Pulp novel, Gangdom's Doom, published in December 1931 in the Shadow magazine and by series creator and primary writer Walter B. Gibson. Now this is a very well-known story within the Shadow fan community, particularly for the notable event that sets the plot in motion. This is not really a spoiler as it's the first thing you'll hear or read about when you see this particular story being discussed, and that is how it opens with the killing of Claude Fellows, one of the Shadow's agents, and the agent who is the primary communications man between the other agents and the mysterious Shadow himself for the first four stories up to this point. So opening the fifth story with the killing of one of the major agents shows how this is upping the stakes dramatically, and it does set the entire plot in motion. Of course, this meant the loss of a major character that had been developed, and I think it was something that both writer Walter B. Gibson and the editors at Street and Smith realized was probably not the best idea, because they'd spent all this time building up one of the agent characters only to do away with him, and then they had to basically recreate that character in a new character who performed the same duties, but then they had to set up that character and he would basically act much as Claude Fellows had. So the death of Claude Fellows here in book 5 is actually the only time in the entire series where an agent is killed. But again, it does set the tone for the story immediately, which is one of a much faster and more focused pace than the previous 4 books. So already you see once again the series is growing even with its 5th installment, and it is building on the successes of the past 4 stories, inching ever more towards the completed Shadow in terms of the full characterization, the world fully realized, and allowing the writer to then take one of several pathways. Will it be a Shadow story that's more of a small-scale mystery? Will it be a Shadow story set in Chinatown? Will it be a Shadow story that's more on the global arena with earth-shattering consequences? Will it be an out-and-out action story? And will it be an out-and-out crime story? Well, Gangdom's Doom is the latter. It is the most out-and-out crime story yet, as the death of Claude Fellows is in relation to him working a case in Chicago. He's been trying to convince a potential lead into the Chicago mob, as this is 1931, still in the midst of Prohibition, when the gangs ruled Chicago, and it was one of the most dangerous cities in the world. The potential informant is taken out, and then Claude Fellows himself is taken out. The mob thinking he's merely a civilian who's sticking his nose in, and is thus of no consequence, not realizing he is an agent of the Shadow, and they have just invoked the full fury of the Knight of Darkness himself. So the Shadow literally goes to Chicago and takes apart the entire mob one piece at a time. But instead of it being all-out open warfare and endless gun battles and explosions and things like you would get in, say, a Spider novel, this is more of the Red Harvest style of tearing apart the gangs and breaking up the mob from within. The reader gets the sense of this very nicely without it ever being spelled out that this is what the Shadow is going to do. Instead, we see the Shadow's lead agent of Harry Vincent being brought into Chicago, and as usual, he doesn't exactly know why, except for obviously his mysterious employer, the Shadow, has reasons for him to be there, and they also know of the death of Claude Fellows. We are then introduced to the various members and aspects of the Chicago underworld. We meet various gangsters, we meet the various gang factions, and understand the whole dynamic and hierarchy of the power structure of each of those gangs, and that there is a lead gangster who's essentially got his thumb over most of Chicago, and he's trying to exert full and total control, while also knowing that now there's a new player involved. So as usual, the Shadow remains more of a background character. He is alluded to, and we see him at certain moments, but when the Shadow does make an appearance, it is extraordinarily dramatic because they are warranted appearances. We know the Shadow is working at trying to take down the Chicago mob on his own, but we don't know the hows. And so while we are following the reactions of all of the criminals in Chicago, we know the one pulling the strings is the Shadow. We just don't know how or why exactly he's doing certain things. All of this becomes fully apparent at the end of the book, so the climax is satisfying, and the whole final act of the book gives you more of that all-out gang war, and then the action you expect from a story like this. So you don't feel shortchanged in terms of not getting enough action, but most of it is saved towards the end of the book because the Shadow's campaign in Chicago actually takes place over a certain period of time. He doesn't just blow into town and blow things up in the space of a week. Again, it's more of the Red Harvest scenario of taking apart the rival gangs one at a time and pitting them against one another, but it actually goes deeper than that as the Shadow manipulates long-standing rivalries and even helps to forge alliances between rivals. So the book is certainly engaging, but what really makes it work is that it has more of an energetic charge than the books preceding it. The early books always have the sense of the Shadow is not fully formed yet, the world of the stories isn't quite there yet. The earliest books also tend to be a bit longer, and they're a little bit more long-winded, and sometimes the plots can meander here and there a bit. Well, Gangdom's Doom has none of that. This moves like lightning throughout. It is a dramatic increase in terms of the plot focus and pacing, so that is the single greatest improvement over the previous 4 books. And I think it's the easiest of the first 5 stories to just pick up and read if you've never read a Shadow story or if you've never read a 1930s pulp story. It moves the quickest, it's the easiest to get into, and it has the really dramatic, striking opening of the killing of one of the Shadow's agents, which sets everything into motion. So right from that opening, you know that there is going to be hell to pay in Chicago. You know that the Shadow is going to arrive and exact his vengeance and destroy all the gangs, and the suspense of the story is, how is he going to do this? And while reading, you're getting little pieces of the puzzle of what is the Shadow's actual plan. Because you're not let in on it at the beginning, the Shadow's actual plan and will he be able to carry it off is the mystery plot of the book, interestingly. So this is an out-and-out action crime tale, but it does have the requisite mysterious elements of the Shadow being withheld from the reader because we don't know exactly what the Shadow is doing day to day. We can only infer and take the little pieces that we've been able to glean from different events. And so essentially the reader becomes an agent of the Shadow, having to piece together the puzzle and take all of the different events and the character reactions and the alliances and the rivalries and the murders and the corpses that turn up and piece everything together so that by the climax of the story, when we do have the gang warfare and then the final assault that happens, everything makes sense and it all clicks into place. Now, as a modern reader, you will probably be able to guess the main plot twist that's revealed at the ending of the story rather quickly, but it is extraordinarily well done, so there's also a good chance that you might not notice it. But the joy of this story and the genius of Gibson's writing is that really doesn't matter. If you can guess what the plot twist is, which is in regards to a particular character, you don't actually know anything beyond that because you don't know what the Shadow's actual plan is. You can only make guesses. So when we get that final reveal, even if it's something you were already able to kind of figure out, because you didn't know the whys and because you didn't know the hows of the Shadow's plan, the actual plot remains a mystery, and thus the plot twists land and the dramatic twists land. And so you get that final reveal, and it's the final little grace note of the, aha, yes, I knew that must be it, and now I have the whole picture, and now I can see how grand the Shadow's overall scheme was in the first place, and that it was a master plan to basically clean up Chicago in one fell swoop because they dared to kill one of the Shadow's agents. Of course, the Pulp Shadow has no mystical powers, no superpowers, and is yet able to know everything because he is everywhere and the Shadow knows. All of the Shadow's appearances directly in the book are incredibly dramatic, and it makes you savor them, especially when he finally reveals himself to the head gangster of Chicago in full traditional Shadow garb of the slouch hat and dressed in all black with the cloak and, of course, the brace of 45s. The incredible continuity of the series is also continued because we have multiple allusions and mentions of events or characters from the past 4 books. So this is firmly set as story number 5, and we see the return of the criminal Steve Cronin, who goes all the way back to the first story, The Living Shadow, and had appeared in 2 other stories. Here he has migrated to Chicago and is trying to work his way up the mob ladder, so it makes sense why he reappears here, and he is finally dealt with in this story. So that means the reoccurring criminal that got away in previous stories. So not only is that nicely tying off a loose end, but it furthers the sense of continuity because you're directly bringing a character who appeared in 3 previous stories and giving him a reason to be in the setting of story number 5, and finally dealing with that character all at the same time. Gangdom's Doom may not be as historically important as the first 3 of Gibson's Shadow stories, nor may it not have the most complicated plot of the first 5 stories, but it is incredibly important for showing that even this early on, the series could do something as bold as to kill off one of its main characters, and it shows the Shadow in action against not just a criminal or a gang, but all of Chicago in the middle of Prohibition. So while the story might seem simple, part of the joy of Gangdom's Doom is that it's being written and published in 1931 while Prohibition was still going, while the gang still owned Chicago. So it has that time capsule flavor, and that's what makes it feel so vivid, because it was being written in the midst of this era, so it is completely rooted in the days of Prohibition. It's so vividly realized that you can actually picture the Shadow going to Chicago and enacting a similar campaign against organized crime. The story is renowned among fan circles, and the title was the inspiration for the classic work of Shadow reference materials, Gangland's Doom by Frank Ice-Grubber Jr. This was the first major work on the pulp Shadow in terms of being a reference book. It has been republished by the wonderful Shadowed Circle magazine. I've got their lovely hardcover edition here behind me, so if you were ever wondering where that title came from, it's of course a direct reference to Gangdom's Doom. To talk about the primary cover artworks that the story has had, the original magazine issue from December 1931 from Street and Smith has stunning artwork by the legendary artist Jerome Rosen, who did the early Shadow covers. Now, this is similar to his previous covers in that it's a white background. We've got the iconic Shadow title in red, and then we have the central image, which is the Shadow being shot at by what looks like Steve Cronin, who in the story shoots at the Shadow from behind the secret bookcase chamber that's essentially a safe room inside the head gangster's office. And then we have the gangster and his second in command here in the bottom. But we've also got here in the bottom corner, once again, the usage of the original illustration mock-up of the Shadow when he was only a radio announcer. So that image is really a holdover from how the Shadow was originally being marketed for Detective Story magazine Hour. But this is here in the corner with the Gangdom's Doom title. But what's really striking about this cover is not only the brilliant composition, the nice color, but this is where we finally see the Shadow in the traditional costume of dressed in all black with the black slouch hat, the cloak with the red interior, and it's also a wonderful action pose. Before this point, we had seen the Shadow's profile on some of the covers, but never the full Shadow in costume. So this is really important for doing that, and it carries on the traditions established by the previous Rosen covers. It's beautifully illustrated and, of course, has a nice sense of action due to the composition and showing the Shadow in movement and the gun being fired and having the other gangsters down in the bottom looking on. So it's got a wonderful sense of drama and beautiful detail and great color as well. But the the major importances, this is the first appearance of the Shadow in costume on one of the covers. Bantam started republishing all of the classic pulp characters, but started and had their greatest success with the reprinting of the Doc Savage stories. These had the classic James Bama covers, which themselves became iconic and made the series a bestseller all over again. Bantam tried to do the same thing with the Shadow, but never had the same level of success and didn't have a consistent style, nor did they reprint every story. So for Gangdom's Doom, you have this style of Bantam cover with the stylized Shadow logo on the bottom, and what's actually a little bit of a similar idea of having a white background and having the Shadow in costume in an action pose. So I don't know if they were trying to mimic the original Rosen cover artwork, but they actually managed to in a way. And this is wonderfully dramatic and stylized, and wonderfully you don't see the Shadow's face in full detail, as you never need to do that. And there's a nice sense of movement as the Shadow looks like he's coming in off of a rope, and he's already about to fire one of the 45s. So it's got a wonderful sense of drama and really good detail and a great sense of movement. So I think it truly works well. It just doesn't necessarily show the scale of the story, because this is the Shadow versus the mob in Chicago, and the Shadow is coming back with the furious vengeance because one of his agents has been killed. So it's a good cover. You get the sense of the story, and the artwork is really striking. But of course, the original magazine cover is definitive for this particular story. In terms of editions, that's it. You have the original magazine issue, and you have the one Bantam paperback reprinting, which is nowadays a collector's item. So the edition I read, and I think the best version, is the beautiful Sanctum Books edition, which is in volume 101 of their Shadow reprints. So here it is up close. Sanctum would typically put two Shadow stories with similar themes or connections and put them into a single replica reprint volume. Sometimes they would go to 3 or 4 stories. They have lovely matching spines, and then the lovely rear covers, which also give you a little blurb about each story and the original magazine cover artwork. And then they would just choose one of them to put on the front cover. So here they pair the Golden Grotto with Gangdom's Doom, and this is where you get a lovely reproduction of the original Rosen cover artwork. Inside, you get the same lovely Sanctum quality with the original dual-column pulp magazine page layout design and all the original illustrations beautifully restored, plus incredible supplemental and historical pieces in terms of the extras and essays. So here's the opening of Gangdom's Doom with the front piece illustration artwork and the restoration of the original dual-column format. Now, this is an earlier Shadow story, so the only artwork for Gangdom's Doom is that front piece artwork. Later stories would have consistent internal illustrations throughout. The interlude essay is about the background of this story, also further details of the relationship between author Walter B. Gibson and Street and Smith and the editors, also the astounding work schedule that Gibson kept to, and even going into how he was actually working for a magician's show in Bermuda when he was tasked with writing the 5th Shadow novel, and managed to write it while being out of the country and working full-time all at once, because his work abilities were absolutely superhuman. There's further details about the historical period and Prohibition, Capone, and the Chicago mobs, how the story was written around this, and how it did not use actual names. It made custom mob characters for this story that were also heavily based on the real-life characters. So you always get a fantastic amount of historical and background context for all of the stories in these wonderful essays. Then after the second story, you get a nice article about Walter B. Gibson, and then further information about the artists, including the Rosen twins who did the covers. So the Sanctum books really need no introduction if you're a Shadow fan. You've probably already seen and heard of these, but they are truly the gold standard for all pulp reprints. They are beautifully put together, but unfortunately, Condé Nast pulled the rights a couple years ago, so Sanctum Sanctum has pretty much closed up shop, and all of their Shadow, Doc Savage, and other editions of reprints have gone out of print, and they've gotten really scarce. And the Shadow volumes, especially the later ones, did not have as many print runs, and they have become the rarest and thus most expensive. If you go on eBay, you will see some, unfortunately, extremely absurd prices for a lot of these, and it's extremely difficult to piece together a whole collection of the 151 main volumes plus the 2 annuals. Every volume starting with 100 is much more difficult to get and much more expensive because they didn't go through as many print runs. So you can typically find the first 20 or 30 Shadow volumes maybe at increasingly expensive prices, but still affordable. But 100 on, they're very expensive, and it took me a while to actually track down a copy of 101 because I'm trying to read the stories in chronological order. And do keep in mind, the Sanctum volumes don't go chronologically, they go by theme pairings and other things, as they were trying to get the stories that had never been reprinted out first, and then eventually their goal became reprinting every story, and they were able to do all but a few when Condé Nast pulled the rights. So they were at least able to get all of Walter B. Gibson's stories reprinted, but it is very difficult and a very expensive prospect trying to get all of these. So if you're trying to read Gangdom's Doom, you will need to try to find Sanctum Volume 101. But it being Sanctum Volume 101 means that you might want to look for the Bantam Vintage paperback, as that will cost you far less, even in good condition, than Sanctum 101 probably will. Either way, you have to be patient looking on eBay or looking in used bookstores, as you can occasionally find the Bantam Shadow copies for not too terribly much, and Sanctum 101 will cost you quite a bit. So either way, those are your two options, and this is such a fantastic story that I think it's essential for anybody reading the series. It moves with such a wonderful, energetic pace. In the Sanctum edition, it's only about 75 pages, so it is significantly shorter than some of the stories that preceded it, and that's actually a bonus because this story needs that charge and it needs that sense of propulsive action, because at the end of the day, this is a revenge mission. The Shadow isn't clouded by revenge or mortal emotions in the traditional sense, but it's definitely a motivating factor in his decision to take on all of the Chicago underworld. I think Gibson does a remarkable job at writing an all-out crime and action story that remains a Red Harvest type mystery, and is doing this while Prohibition is still going on, and the final fate of Prohibition was still uncertain, as it wouldn't be repealed until 1933. So it's very much of its time, and that's an incredible benefit to reading this story nowadays, because it allows the reader to fully place themselves in that world and wonder what would happen if the Night of Darkness took a hand in Chicago and wasn't just in New York at that time. What if he took on organized crime in the most notorious crime underworld of the United States at that point? I had an absolute blast reading this. I pretty much didn't put it down until I finished. So if you're curious about reading an early Shadow story, this is the easiest one to pick up, as it's very concise, very driven, and you get all the necessary details and the allusions and connections back to the early books to know what's going on, and everything works perfectly. It also gives you the full feeling of the Shadow, so if you've never read one before and this is your first, this is actually a pretty good place to start, as the earlier books are a little bit longer and are establishing more things, and it may not be the easiest thing for somebody to start with the Living Shadow, as that was story 1. So this is also a good entry point if you've never read a Shadow story before. But it's just an incredibly well-executed tale. Everything in it works perfectly. It's got a really increased sense of pace over the previous 4 stories, and it's also very nicely a different tone, a different feeling, and a different approach, which makes the series feel fresh once again, as each story so far has had different elements that make it feel unique, even at this early stage. but we already have the sense of continuity established, so every story fits into the same world, and they feel of a whole, but each one feels distinct and different, and that's what makes the series truly great. So those are my thoughts on the fifth and absolute classic shadow story, Gangdom's Doom, one of the most important foundational tales of the Night of Darkness, and a work that is already cementing how important this series would become, not just to pulp fiction, but to American literature and pop culture at large. As always, I hope my babblings about the shadow and the world of the pulps has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some lovely shadow editions to add to your collection. And until I return with a video on the sixth shadow story, The Death Tower, I just want to say keep reading the magical world of the pulps, keep following the shadow, and thank you ever so much for watching.